to order. Welcome to meeting number 79 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motion adopted on Tuesday, March 7, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss the current state of play on green finance. And then we'll do that over the next hour. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. Appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses, and thank you for coming before committee in with such short notice. And we look forward to hearing from you. From the Department of Finance, we have Robert Sample, the Director General, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Division. And from the Financial Sector Policy Branch, we've got Matthew Bolt, Director of Markets and Security Policy, Financial Sector Policy Branch. And we look forward to hearing your opening statement and then getting to members' questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for having us here today to appear as witnesses. Both Matt and I are very pleased to be with you to support your study on green finance, an important and timely topic in the context of building Canada's net zero economy. In keeping with my responsibilities, I will focus my remarks on the Government of Canada's efforts to develop the foundational market infrastructure needed to scale up Canada's sustainable finance market. This work is about promoting market transparency. For example, by enhancing climate disclosures, defining green and transition investments, and improving climate data to ensure that climate considerations can be properly incorporated into business and investment decisions. As the public sector alone cannot fund the net zero transition, getting the foundational market infrastructure right in a timely manner is vital to mobilizing the private sector capital needed over time to realize Canada's climate objectives. Recognizing the importance of engaging with Canada's financial sector on these market infrastructure matters, the Government of Canada established the Sustainable Finance Action Council, or the SFAC, in May 2021 to help lead Canada's financial sector towards integrating sustainable finance into standard industry practice. The SFAC is chaired by Kathy Bardswick and comprises 25 Canadian deposit-taking institutions, insurance companies, and pension funds, with combined assets over $10 trillion. The SFAC's terms of reference call on it to provide financial sector input to the Government of Canada on the development of foundational market infrastructure, including enhancing climate disclosure, defining green and transition investment, and improving climate data and analytics. More recently, in Budget 2022, the Government of Canada asked the SFAC to develop and report on strategies for aligning private sector capital with a net zero transition. With support from the Canadian Climate Institute and in collaboration with the Net Zero Advisory Body. The SFAC has played an important role in convening representatives from Canada's financial sector to engage on market infrastructure issues and to provide its expert advice to the Government of Canada. In the course of its work, it has engaged with a range of domestic and international stakeholders on sustainable finance to exchange views and ensure that its advice is comprehensive and consistent with best practices. At the Government of Canada's request, the SFAC has prioritized work on climate disclosures. Soon after launch, the SFAC provided initial perspectives on how to enhance climate disclosures, and then provided a submission to the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, setting out its views on the ISSB's draft global disclosure standards on climate and sustainability reporting. More recently, The SFAC has prepared advice on how to effectively implement the Government of Canada's commitment to move towards mandating climate disclosures across a broad spectrum of the Canadian economy. The SFAC has also prioritized work on taxonomy, and late last year submitted the Taxonomy Roadmap report to the Government of Canada, which sets out its advice, the SFAC advice, on the design, governance, and implementation of a Canadian green and transition finance taxonomy. The report was published on the Government of Canada website as SFAC advice. The Government of Canada is studying the report's advice, and there will be continued collaboration with SFAC and other financial sector leaders on taxonomy. A few words on climate disclosure. I would highlight that the Government of Canada is making important progress in meeting its Budget 2022 commitment to move towards mandatory climate reporting across a broad spectrum of the Canadian economy. For example, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI, earlier this week published its final climate risk management and disclosure guidance for federally regulated financial institutions. This is an important development since it will make climate disclosures mandatory for more than 350 banks and insurers. Canada's federal crown corporations have been asked to adopt TCFD or equivalently rigorous standards applicable to the public sector as an element of their corporate reporting. Implementation is underway. And finally, provincially and importantly, provincial and territorial securities regulators are also acting in this area. They have published a draft climate disclosure rule for public companies. We would be pleased to take any questions from the members of the committee. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your opening remarks. And we're going to get to the members' questions right now. Just members will look to get through 2 rounds. So in the opening round, each party will have up to 6 minutes for questions. We're starting with the Conservatives and MP Morantz, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sample and Mr. Bolt, for being here and for your opening remarks. I want to take a bit of a step back from your opening remarks because I think this is a new concept for many Canadians. Us here in the Ottawa bubble may be somewhat familiar. I know Ms. Chattel is very familiar with this, but the average Canadian watching this meeting today might not understand or even know what green finance is. So I'm wondering if you could sort of step back from the bureaucratese, if you will, and just from a layman's perspective, tell us what it means.
Thank you very much for your question. Particularly for a country like Canada, it really involves 2 aspects. One, the green finance, so it's capital markets or financial activity or investment into low or zero emitting activities, economic activities. But particularly for a country like Canada, transition finance is also important. And that is, financing the decarbonization or decarbonizing emission-intensive activities that are critical for sectoral transformation. So, in a broad sense, I would leave it with those two definitions, if that's helpful.
So who provides this financing? Is it the government? Is it financial institutions? Is it a joint venture between government and financial institutions? If someone wanted to get financing, for example, to build a wind farm, where would they go for this type of financing? Also, if you could comment on whether the terms of that loan might be better than, for example, an ordinary loan. For example, would the interest rates be lower? Would the placement fees be lower? Would the amortizations on those loans be more generous? That kind of thing. Like, what differentiates this kind of financing from ordinary market financing?
There's a variety of financing mechanisms, and likely more that will be elaborated over the coming years and decades. There is public sector funding at federal and provincial levels for this type of activity and investment. However, the amount of investment that's required cannot rely solely on public sector funding, and there is a ramping up of private sector capital mobilization into these types of green and transition activities. And so from a capital markets perspective, it could be support with debt financing, it could be loans to companies and other types of financial instruments.
the terms be more favorable, though, to an ordinary market loan because it's a green project?
I can't speak to
You don't know.
specific terms.
Okay, and what qualifies as a project that would qualify for green finance? For example, I think probably a wind farm might be, but there's certain gray areas in my mind. For example, LNG could substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions all over the world, even though it's a fossil fuel, because it could supplant, for example, oil or coal-fired plants, things like that. Nuclear also, for example, would be a good example of something like that. Would that qualify for a green financing loan? What about, for example, mining operations that mine precious metals that are used, for example, to create batteries in electric vehicles? So I think there might be some areas where it's not completely clear, like whether or not it would be something that would qualify for green finance. And I guess my question is my analysis around that correct? And secondly, who would decide whether or not a project would qualify for this type of loan?
Thank you for your question, and a couple of elements just to tease out there. One is there's types of projects or economic activities that are green, so these are low emitting. But also importantly, I think you're pointing to a number of transition activities that require decarbonization, but will be critical factors in economic prosperity for Canada. In terms of your second part of the question, in terms of who determines, currently there is no public sector determination of what is green or what is transition. As I noted in my opening remarks, the Sustainable Finance Action Council has submitted its advice to government, which the government is reviewing, in terms of what's called a taxonomy, which could provide some additional granularities to the criteria of what is green and transition. But there is no decisions or opinion from the government at this time on that report.
This is a future area of regulation for government where they might actually stipulate what banks need to say how banks can decide which projects qualify and which projects couldn't? Or is that where this is going?
Thank you for your question. I can't speculate at this time on future areas of policy work or decisions by the government.
Okay, and
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, 10 seconds. I just
We'll
thought. So we're going to move over to the Liberals and MP Chattel, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bold and Semple, for being with us today. Look, clearly the role of our government, of any responsible government, is really to empower and to protect. We need, as the world, and not just Canada, but the world is moving towards a market infrastructure where investment will need to be green, and our business will need to meet those challenges and those criteria in order to be successful. Our role is really to invest in their success. And so that's why this study is very, very important to us. We wanted to know, a little bit like MP Morin just said, we wanted to know and to be able to explain to regular businesses what are the challenges that they will be facing as the world is transiting towards a green market infrastructure. One of the key issues that you mentioned earlier is what is green? And if, for example, if we have big collective investment vehicle, in order to meet the criteria for investment, they need to have green portfolios. What would it mean to be green in their portfolio? What investment will be considered green? I know there's a lot of work. It's actually, there's a G20 Sustainable Finance group and a roadmap that have they have key actions, but action number 2 is really to try to identify and help countries and financial market and institution to define the standards, the international standard on what would it means to be green, but also kind of brown also, because there's some products or investment, a product that will not necessarily be green, but will be helping the transition towards a green economy. So could you tell us a little bit more on 2 things? What is the work at the international level of what is the green finance, and what are countries together doing? The Europe, I know, is ahead of many countries, many regions, also the UK. Can you explain where the world stands right now in terms of green finance? And second, what it means for Canadian business?
Thank you very much for the question. The Group of 20, the G20, has been actively working on similar themed work that Canada is domestically on what's called sustainable finance. And so there is a G20 group that reports to ministers and leaders that is trying to elaborate and share information on disclosure regimes, so climate disclosure regimes, other types of market infrastructure elements, and on data, challenges and opportunities. I don't have, in terms of you did, as part of your question, have where does Canada sit with the other jurisdictions? I think definitely, I think Europe would consider itself a leader in terms of the steps that it has taken. And the United Kingdom. This G20 does have a website that reports on progress that countries are making against its own roadmap on disclosure and other climate-related regulatory activities. So that gives a bit of a sense of the work that's going on at the international level at the G20. A really important development has been the standing up of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which the Government of Canada, along with other governments in the private sector, provided seed funding for a satellite office in Montreal. And so most in the international fora, and we do as well in Canada, see that baseline standard setting, global baseline standard setting by the International Sustainability Standards Board to be of critical importance. And that's because of globalization. We have many companies in Canada that work across borders, have clients across borders, have different regulatory impacts across borders. And so if the ISSB can help support some harmony across standards, across jurisdictions, I think that would be helpful. And I think that's an important aspect for your final question around what will it mean for Canadian businesses, and indeed there's the regulatory burden or harmony that they'll need to maneuver, but it's also the expectations of various jurisdictions on what their products are deemed as from an economic or from a green or from a transition perspective.
Chantal, yeah, the time does go fast, and we've got MP Garon with us today for the block. Welcome. In 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. You spoke about the SFAC, and they were asked to design a plan so that we could eventually get to net zero. My understanding is that the members of the Sustainable Finance Action Council are from the financial sector, insurance companies, banks, and big managers. So these are institutions that don't have exactly a wonderful track record when it comes to innovation and the climate. Is there a problem with transparency? We've got a sector that has been delinquent in many respects, and yet they're submitting a roadmap to the government and behind closed doors. Can we trust the government on this with this process?
Merci beaucoup pour ta question.
Thank you very much for the question. Apologies, but I'll answer in English.
I would say that there's a number of different aspects to a government taking a decision on a policy. The Sustainable Finance Action Council is comprised of 25 private sector financial institutions. It has a mandated work plan, and that is one piece of the puzzle that I would say. It has 4 expert groups where on data, climate disclosures, taxonomy, and net zero capital allocation that engage regularly with a variety of stakeholders. Some of that engagement is listed on the Government of Canada's website in terms of who the Sustainable Finance Action Council has engaged with and brought in inputs from. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, something like taxonomy or advice that the government receives on disclosure, that's one input as the government is, considering any policy actions, the pros and cons, various considerations. It does its own consultation as well, in addition to what the SFAC might have done with a variety of stakeholders. So just wanted to outline that as well. Further,
Si vous permettez,
okay.
But if I may, the nature of my concern is as follows. Over the last 25, 30 years, we've had banks that have acted in their own interest in the short term more and more with SMEs, and there's been more credit for consumption, and a larger portion of their profits have been from fees. And so it's no longer what it used to be. We're being charged $4 at the ATM. From a public point of view, are we right to be concerned that these are the people being asked in 2022 to come up with a strategy for us to get to net zero? Should the public, are they right in concerning that there are members of the financial sector? Well, they're getting involved. Is this concern well-founded, in your opinion?
Thank you for your question. It's important to have a variety of stakeholder perspectives when government policy is being considered. The SFAC, as I mentioned, brings in 25 private sector financial institutions. That's one perspective on advice that comes to the government, and they have consulted on all of their activities. I would say, in terms of your questions around banks specifically, another way to consider this is that there are 2 regulators that will be attaching rules to federally regulated banks and some provincially regulated institutions as well. So the Canadian Securities Administrators for publicly traded entities, it's done a consultation, not just with the institutions that it regulates, but public consultation receives input from a variety of stakeholders on those proposed disclosure rules. Similarly, with the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, I hope you have a chance to speak with them. I believe that on their...
Si vous me permettez.
If I may, well, I understand that you're avoiding the question a little, and that's totally fine. You're doing your work. I'd like to know, this council, the SFAC, has a very strong advisory role because they submitted this to the department, and it's taken very seriously. At the department, does one have to juggle with the fact that a similar mandate has been given could be given to an advisory council that could be made up of different citizen members that would have the same weight in the department's eyes, as opposed to people who have different interests because they work directly in the sector.
Sure. I could respond to that quickly. I mean, I think one example that I would point to that addresses some of what you mentioned in your question, the Net Zero Advisory Body is another body that has been stood up by the minister responsible for environment and climate change. And I think they have a broader mandate, which is to look at the transition, the economic pathways, like how can Canada get to net zero to meet its climate goals, a much broader mandate. We're not directly responsible for that initiative, but I think I'd point you to that as an area that you might want to look at. And I would just say that the SFAC, in contrast, it's much more narrow, the mandate, right? It's to focus on how the financial sector can, like, what can the financial sector do to incorporate sustainable finance into its standard industry practices. So that's, one piece of the puzzle, and that Net Zero Advisory Body has a much broader mandate.
Figaro, and now to the NDP, MP Blakey for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I guess to start, because this is the first meeting that we're having on this study, I wanted to just come back to Mr. Morant's question, because I think it's a really important question. I think it's the question that animates the reason for the study, and I think it's important for the committee to kind of get it right conceptually from the beginning in terms of what it is that we're studying and the kinds of questions that we're asking. And as I understand it, there's certainly a great debate to be had, and I'm a partisan in that debate about the role of government in delivering on a decarbonized economy and what that means for Canadians in terms of the infrastructure that they have and the electricity that they use, and what it means for workers in terms of where they fit into that picture. And that's a whole debate that we can have about the role of government, and I think it's an important one. My understanding is that the study we're embarked upon right now is to say, notwithstanding that debate, we understand that a lot of folks in financial markets, financial institutions, are coming to understand, despite their legacy of not having done a good job, which Ms. Garon has rightly pointed out, and I think there's cause for some ongoing suspicion, and I think that's part of what we're looking at today. They are figuring out that this is important. They want to respond to investors and consumers who are demanding more from the companies that they fund in terms of environmental responsibility. They're recognizing the serious warnings that have been issued about economic disruption and the very real costs to those very same financial institutions in the event of environmental calamity. And I think they're having some sense that they should probably do something about that. Welcome to the party, I say to them. It's been a long time coming, and yes, they absolutely do have something to do with that. And I think they're also trying to position themselves in what they rightly see as the economy of the future. The economy is changing, and they don't want to be left behind in that. So that's all well within the kind of market view that many parties around this table espouse, and is nevertheless important, even for those of us who think there is more of a role for the public sector in leading the charge and being quite prescriptive towards these organizations and how they should play a role. So that's why I think this is important. I think it's why certain important market players finally are figuring it out, that they need to be there, and that's a combination of largely different forms of self-interest, but they're coming to the table in any event. And so I take us to be looking at the kind of infrastructure that has to be in place, not for them to do that, because they can do that on their own. They can finance projects if they want, but they're looking for some guidance, because the traditional models of economic and financial analysis for projects that they fund have tended, as Ms. Garon also pointed out, to exclude environmental projects. They're seen as high risk. They don't, partly because you don't have historical economic data to be able to make empirical predictions about the performance of these types of investment, or at least that's what they would say. I'm not sure that that's actually true, but that's what they would say. And so they're trying to develop models to be able to evaluate the long-term success of investments in these kinds of projects. But I think even more importantly for our purposes, the question is, how do consumers and investors in Canada, whether that's because actually a lot of the large investors do have access to privileged information and they can have some level of confidence in the economic or financial viability of an investment. How do you produce that for your more run-of-the-mill Canadian investor who has some RRSPs, who's looking to invest in different kinds of funds, wants to have a sense of ownership over where their money goes and have their money support things that they think in the long term are good things, and try not to support things that they think in the long term are detrimental either to the environment or to other things? And so that's why we talk about standards of transparency and accountability. How do we develop metrics for your typical Canadian investor consumer to be able to evaluate whether, if they're investing in certain kinds of things, they can have some confidence that companies are acting in good faith to try and lower their emissions over time? How do we measure that? So that's part of what I take us to be studying here. That's part of the project. And I think there is obviously a role for government to play in laying out reporting requirements and developing metrics so that Canadians are comparing apples to apples when they're considering where to put their money. That may not be the entirety of what we're doing, but it's certainly an important part of what I take us to be doing. And so I hope that's a bit of a supplementary answer to Mr. Morantz's question in terms of what we're doing. It's not just about, kind of government coming in and setting up these definitions. Actually, it's pretty much the Wild West right now. And it's about trying to figure out, both for the public interest, but also even just within the context of the market, how financial actors who are currently saying they want to do better job, can do a better job, and can be seen to be doing a better job, and that we can measure that. And I think those are all important things to be able to do. So my question for you is, you indicated a little bit about the development of certain standards for reporting, but it seems to me there's a few different areas that are important to the kind of new lower carbon economy that's emerging. There's primary resource extraction. There's the development of clean tech and the intellectual property that comes with that. There's then, once you have those components, there's the manufacturing of components for a lower carbon economy, and then there's critical infrastructure, around electrification, for instance, of various industries in Canada, as well as items for personal use like cars and things like that. So there's 4 categories, presumably may have some different reporting requirements. So what is your taxonomy of kind of the different categories of work and investment that go into the new lower carbon economy? And what is the discussion around the different kinds of metrics that we need to have companies be transparent about?
We're just well over the 6 minutes already.
I thought I had a 6-minute preamble and then 5 minutes of questions.
I hear you. Maybe the witnesses could get those questions in the second round, because we do want to get through a full second round, as I had mentioned to members. So we do have to move over to the second round, and we're starting with the Conservatives MP Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome. Nice to have you both here with us today. Just kind of high level, not looking for specifics, but just generalities. Have there been any work on quantifying some of the costs associated with moving to net zero? What's that going to cost Canada to move to net zero? Is that a number that has been looked into, or kind of a broad range? I've heard globally it's 3.5 or 4 trillion. What's that look like for Canada?
I would say that's a bit out of the ambit of our expertise from a financial sector policy perspective. That might be a question better placed with another ministry.
Okay. From the financial sector policy perspective, then, what about the disclosure requirements? What costs associated with that can market participants expect to be having to incur?
That's a good question. I don't have an empirical number in terms of cost of burden of whether it be securities commissions, provincial securities commissions, or OSFI, in terms of how much we'll go into that. I think in the context of OSFI, they would look at it as these are risks to the institution that the institution should be mindful of and proactively monitoring and mitigating. and reporting is part of that transparency that they put into their guideline that was passed earlier this week.
You mentioned OSFI. Is OSFI consulting with finance on changing capital requirements for borrowers in high emitting sectors?
Yeah, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, it's the superintendent's an independent agency that regulates fairly regulated financial institutions. As OSFI does develop and elaborate on guidelines, it has a committee with the Bank of Canada, the Department of Finance, the deposit insurer, and the Consumer Affairs Commissioner, where feedback can be provided. I believe in OSFI's guideline that it published earlier this week, it was, what it elaborated on the most was governance and disclosure. And, I think perhaps there's more work to come on capital. That's something that I think is best pointed in the direction of OSFI for an answer.
Right. And OSFI's mandate, are they getting at this through a risk basis? I mean, what realistically does OSFI have to do with telling a financial institution on their borrower that they have to hold more capital against a borrower in a particular industry?
That's a good question. Again, likely best positioned with a representative from OSFI, but they have opined on that publicly in terms of how they see climate risk impacting financial institutions. They see it as a stability issue to be assessed, monitored, and mitigated with financial institutions. And so, they do have public material on that. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to just note I think we'd be benefit if we had OSFI here. They've come up a number of times, so that would be, just put that on the list or a takeaway for later. Excellent. What's China doing in this space?
In green
finance, are they doing any of this?
I don't have the specifics on hand with me today, although they are a member of the G20 and will be reporting on their progress publicly against a roadmap that a G20 group has set out, again, on disclosure and other elements of market infrastructure.
If they choose to do their own thing or not participate in some of the global standards, it's not going to matter what Canada does from a pollution perspective or getting to net zero if them and other large emitters, Russia, Brazil, Canada's going to incur a lot of costs potentially for, potentially not really doing much work on the pollution reduction.
That's the time. We're moving to Liberals and MP Baker.
Thanks very much, and I'm going to cede my time to Madame Chatel.
Okay, Madame Chatel.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The question from MP Chambers is an important one, but I'm seeing it from the reverse side. The G20, with all the ministers of finance, clearly established that it is only a question of time, but that at one point we are all going to require financial institutions to have a net zero portfolio. They will have to be. And some banks in Europe already are. They have an action plan to get there. So in such a world where the G20, the financial institutions of Europe, China, and other countries, they are all saying there you go, we will have a net zero portfolio. What will be the impact on Canada if it does not work as you are doing on putting in place the infrastructure, the information, and the standards in order to be ready to deal with this? And in order to be successful in this market and in this sector?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I might answer it in a slightly different way, which is that I believe in OSFI's guideline that it released earlier this week, a transition plan is a requirement of a financial institution. So I can't speak to whether that's similar or dissimilar from what the expectation would be in Europe. But that is already occurring. So factually, that will be a requirement of fairly regulated financial institutions.
Donc, c'est déjà
So it's already happening. I thought we had more time, but you're confirming that no. The requirements to have a transition plan in place for a net zero portfolio is already in place in Canada. It's already happening, and we're following Europe and China and the other G20 countries. So perhaps to answer my conservative colleague, we're not talking about the cost of putting this in place, but rather the cost of inaction, because that would be catastrophic for Canada. That's what I'm understanding. Now, clearly, and I'm coming back to this question a bit, you had highlighted this earlier. The 2022 budget includes new funding for the International Sustainability Standards Board. So this is big. Here in Canada, in Montreal, we have a center that's developing international standards on what sustainable finance is. So this is about sustainable finance. How can this organization in Montreal, one office is in Montreal in any case, how will it allow, well, we were talking about taxonomy earlier, and what's important is having an international standard. Why is it so important to have an international standard?
Thank you very much for the question. One element, I think it's just, I've mentioned this already, is that having a global baseline that countries can look to adapt or tailor, with their specific jurisdictional considerations is very helpful, particularly for multinational companies that might have regulatory requirements across more than just Canada, United States, Europe, Asia. So having that global baseline where there's harmonization to the extent possible of disclosure standards, for example. And just to clarify, my understanding at present with the ISSB is that it's focused on climate disclosure reporting. I think that's what its initial focus is on, and it's going to be publishing the final global baseline or benchmark for those reporting standards later on in 2023.
Je sais que la Caisse populaire Desjardins mettait déjà.
I know that the Caisse populaire and Desjardins are already putting forward an action plan in order to come up with a net zero portfolio. For the small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada, how will they be impacted by this decision by the G20 and by other countries and banks and large institutions to transition towards net zero portfolios?
Well, generally speaking, the requirements require Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 reporting, which has a value chain dimension to it with Scope 3 reporting, where if you're an inputter into the production of various economic activities or products, that's important to take account. So there will, as is being set out, there will be a need for, smaller and medium-sized industry to be able to report that type of information. I think there is a recognition, however, that the ability of those smaller, medium-sized entities to be able to report that information, they're not on the same scale as a large company or financial institution, so there will need to be some tailoring to those regulatory standards to meet that.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Chattel. And over to the block. And I see MP Samaris here, but MP Garon has some questions for the block for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really liked that Ms. Chattel highlighted that Montreal is taking on an important role in establishing international standards. However, she forgot to mention that in the event where Quebec is independent, well, then it would be the one that would be shining abroad with its expertise. In the meantime, I have a question on another subject. In 2020, the International Regulatory Bank said that in one of its studies, there is a significant concentration in mining and fossil fuels of businesses that are called zombies. So banks have a tendency to inject more and more capital into them in order to avoid borrowing them from their books. Now, this is, well, I know it's quite complex, but I know that this is the type of behavior that one might want to regulate at one point. But when it comes to the Department of Finance, there was an assessment here in Canada on the importance of this phenomenon and the resources that are reinvested by the banks in these businesses and the risk that the concentration, the number of these zombie businesses exist in the oiling and in the oil and gas industry. So my question is, have you worked on this? Or has there been a study of the state of things currently? And if so, is there a way that information could be submitted to the committee so we know what was done at the Department of Finance?
Thank you very much for the question. Matt nor I have personally worked on that type of analysis. I might point you to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions and the Bank of Canada from two perspectives. One, they have done some pilot work on climate risk scenario analysis, so helping, something that's there to help build out institutions how they model and assess risk.
La question portait sur la
The question, no, I am aware of that, but the question is about the number of these zombie businesses.
On the second part, I think, another reason why I point you in the direction of OSFI is because, understanding client risk and counterparty risk is going to be very important for financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, et cetera. And so that will be, I would imagine, part of the risk analysis that OSFI will be expecting for financial institutions.
And now to the NDP, MP Blakey for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So, historically, the financial sector doesn't have a great track record of prioritizing decarbonization projects. They're not experts in decarbonization. They're experts in finance. In terms of the advisory bodies for the minister, or for OSFI for that matter, that are going to provide advice on the metrics and the transparency requirements for financial institutions and companies to report out on, to evaluate whether they have a net zero portfolio. Who sits on those advisory committees that are outside the financial sector, that have expertise on the science of decarbonization?
Okay. Thank you, MP Blakey. I think, the SFAC has consulted. So I hear the point that you're making, that it is a financial sector. It is composed of financial institutions. They have done outreach with groups outside the financial sector, and you can see
it seems to me that it's a different level of engagement, and frankly, a different level of opportunity for education on the part of those in the financial sector who are going to be providing advice on this, to have people at the table who, as part of their deliberations and decision-making process, are going to have input on what those standards ultimately are.
Yeah.
And it seems to me to be a big miss to not have some voices at the table that have that as their background. Not because the financial expertise isn't required, but it seems odd to me that people with only financial expertise would be the decision makers, and that there wouldn't be other voices welcomed into that decision making process.
I think it would, if the, I understand that members of the SFAC may be called to this committee and they could elaborate on this, but the taxonomy report that we spoke about earlier, that has been published on the Government of Canada website that the SFAC submitted to the ministers, they had a lot of input from the Canadian Climate Institute in developing that report. They provided, the Canadian Climate Institute provided some of that scientific expertise that I think you're referencing. I think it's a very important point. And I think in their recommendations, they are, trying to put that out there, that there would be a need, like if there was going to be a taxonomy implemented, that there would need to be other people in the governance of that structure. It could not just be FIs. I think that is one of their recommendations. But I think they could elaborate on that.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Blakey. And now to the Conservatives for 5 minutes, MP Hallen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have I wanted to use my time before I pass it over to Mr. Chambers. I wanted to use my time to give notice of the following motion here at the public meeting of the Finance Committee. The motion reads that given interest rates are at the highest level since the 2008 recession and mortgages have significantly increased since 2015, the Standing Committee on Finance undertake a study on the impact of inflation and interest rates on mortgages in Canada, and that the study includes, but is not limited to, the increase in the number of mortgages hitting their trigger rate and the number of mortgages that have had their amortization period increased beyond 25 years. That the committee include in its witness list the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, and representatives from the Big Six Canadian banks. That the committee take no less than 4 meetings for this study, and that the committee report its findings to the House. Mr. Chair, I think this study is very important given the climate of today's of the economy today. And we've seen how housing and mortgages have become more unaffordable than ever for Canadians. I hear firsthand from Canadians about the pain they're facing because of rising interest rates and inflation brought on by out-of-control spending by the government, single mothers unable to make raising mortgage payments, first-time homeowners having their mortgages hitting their trigger rates, and the dream of homeownership out of reach for so many young people. We see people making tough decisions whether they pay for shelter or for food. 1 in 5 Canadians are starting to skip meals. Recently, we also heard from banks such as RBC and CIBC, 20% of their mortgages are at a point where the borrower's monthly payments are not even covering interest costs. We also know now that mortgages are being extended beyond 25-year amortization, with questions about the effect this will have on borrowers and the mortgage market. All of this is concerning for homeowners and future homeowners. That is why I am giving notice of this important motion today. Thank you.
MP Howland, and the time, you still have 3 minutes left, and that's to MP Chambers. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to talk about nomenclature. In the G20 discussions, is there talk about like defining ESG, the certifications? It's an unregulated moniker that's tossed around a lot. Is there international discussion about how to get control over the term ESG or what it means to be green?
Yeah, I can take a quick stab and say that the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group has been primarily focused on climate over the last couple of years. That group is co-chaired by the U.S. Treasury and by the People's Bank of China, and it's become elevated up to a working group, I think, since 2020. So it's been focused on climate. India has the presidency of the G20 right now, and they are actually interested in broadening the discussion to be a bit less specifically focused on climate and also focused on some of the other sustainable development goals. So I don't know that that directly answers your question, but that is the sort of the direction the G20 is going in right now.
Thank you. I mean, I think the challenge that people have is there's this notion that greenwashing happens. You know, you slap ESG moniker on something. BlackRock introduced what I think they call a U.S. carbon readiness ETF product, calls it ESG. They raise $1.25 billion in a single day, which is a record. Guess what the top 3 holdings are of that fund? ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. The top ESG fund manager in the year 2020 and 21 in the UK, right? So these are the top financial fund managers who manage ESG assets. Guess what the top fund managers' top holdings were? ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Valiant, Shell. There is zero consistency or regulation with respect to using the term green or sustainable. It's more of a, in some cases, used much more as a marketing scheme than it is realistically. So that is something else I'm interested in, and I think that's my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Chambers. And we are going now to MP Zarowitz, who's with us virtually. MP Zarowitz for 5 minutes, please. And you'll be our last questioner. You're muted, MP Zarowitz.
Let me unmute.
There you
Hello.
go.
Thank you so much. Anyways, I wanted to say a huge thanks to Mr. Sample, Mr. Bolt for joining us today and for introducing or being part of the very first part of this very important study. The creation of the Canadian Sustainable Finance Action Council was actually one of the 15 recommendations that was made in the Sustainable Finance Report that was actually put out in 2019. And if you actually, it's actually part of recommendation number 3. What it actually indicated was that there should be a Canadian Sustainable Finance Action Council created to advise, assist the federal government in implementing the panel's recommendations. And I know you've indicated that SFAC is helping to sort of create sort of that framework around the sort of mandatory climate reporting. I wanted to know what role, if any, SFAC will have in terms of implementing any of the other 14 recommendations.
Thank you for that question. I think you're referring to the expert panel on sustainable finance that had delivered a report to the Ministers of Finance and Environment and Climate Change in 2019. And
yes.
and you're correct that report included a wide range of recommendations. I think there were 15 recommendations. And you're correct that one of the recommendations was to create a Sustainable Finance Action Council. And I would also say that there were a number of other recommendations in there that related to what we've been talking about here today, the creation of financial market infrastructure to sort of support the growth of a sustainable finance market. So climate disclosures, green and transition investment standards, climate data, those were areas where the expert panel had recommendations, and those are areas that are in the core mandate of the Sustainable Finance Action Council. I would add that some of the other expert panel recommendations went beyond financial market infrastructure and into what I might call sectoral policy areas, such as infrastructure, electricity, and clean technology. And those areas, I think, Robert and I would say, are a bit beyond our expertise. It's more broader economic policy. I would say that in Budget 2022, the government did add an element to the SFAC's mandate, which is to look at net zero capital allocation strategies. And I think in doing this work, the SFAC is going to look at some of those sectors and say, how could this financial sector mobilize capital into infrastructure? How could it mobilize capital into electricity? So it will get into that a little bit, but some of those expert panel recommendations are a bit broader. I think the expert panel had also recommended that Canada map its economic plan to net zero, and I think that was a very broad recommendation that is probably more in the ambit of the net zero advisory body that I mentioned a bit earlier.
Okay, no, I appreciate that because I actually was going to go there next, Mr. Bolt. What I'd be grateful for just written purposes, just because I don't have time to go to each one, if you could just submit to this committee, because we're going to move forward on this topic, which of the 15 recommendations are actually being are being implemented by SFAC, or the finance team sort of broadly. That would be helpful. The first recommendation I was going to get to, and you sort of ended off, it was map Canada's long-term path to low emissions, climate smart economy, sector by sector, with an associated capital plan. Is there anyone within government that is actually looking at that and doing that? It might not be your department, but do you know of anyone that's actually taken that on?
I think that question, like the broad economic plan, the sector by sector plan to net zero, would be best addressed to the Environment and Climate Change Ministry.
Okay, thank you so much. And then I think I have 10 minutes left, so 10 seconds left. So I just want to say thank you so much for your excellent contribution today.
MP Zerwitz, and we want to thank our officials. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for appearing before the committee for this study, Mr. Bolt, Mr. Sample, and we really appreciate it. I just want to have the members, you would have received just quickly members' budgets for this committee, and just wanted to see if we have approval for those. Yep, all thumbs up. We're all good. There's no travel. No travel, MP Chambers. Okay, so I see that, we do have approval. Great. Okay, thank you, everybody. We're going to adjourn this meeting at this time. Okay, I'm going to grab something to eat.